Welcome to Class Time, your daily classroom for CSEC and CAPE students. Today's lesson is CSEC Home Economics, and I am Lydia Dunn. Today, we'll be looking at pastry making. So let's get to the lesson. All right, so our objectives for today are, you can see here I have your general objective. So at the end of the lesson, you should appreciate set standards, which are essential for food preparation service and acceptance. And then specifically now, we want you to define the terms related to pastry, identify types of pastry, explain the steps and precautions for each method, discuss the functions of ingredients used in each method, and analyze characteristics of a good pastry. Now, from our objectives, we're going to get our content outline. And your content outline is basically your subtopics. All right? So this is basically just a repetition. And just for note taking, you can write it like this in your notebooks, and then you're going to complete your KWL chart. Now, you know I cannot leave out the KWL chart. We have been doing our lessons, and remember, our KWL chart is what you already know in relation to the subject, or the topic rather, what you want to know, and at the end of the lesson, when you're going to assess yourself now, you're going to say what it is you have learned. And if for whatever reason in today's lesson, I didn't cover what you wanted to learn, or what you, please, I'm encouraging you, speak with your teachers, go back to school or even read, and then you'll answer your own questions. All right, so we're going to be starting with definition of some key terms. Oftentimes, persons just categorize pastry as anything sweet that you're going to eat, and that's not necessarily the case. So, as it relates to food and nutrition, and this is actually universally accepted, pastry is a dough. It is made of flour, fat, and water. And it can be used to create a variety of dishes, and these dishes can be sweet or savory. Savory meaning not sweet, just to make that clear. Now, there are different ways or techniques that we use when we're making pastry. One such technique is rubbed in. Some texts will tell you rubbed in, some will say rubbing in. So I choose to use rubbing in because that's what's familiar to me. But if you have rubbed in, you're okay. And now this is a technique where the flour is rubbed into the fat to make dishes such as short crust pastry. Now, this is a very popular technique. It's a very easy technique. When we're doing pastry making, this is one of the techniques that we start out first with our students. And once you master this technique, I promise you, the rest is history. And I want to also encourage you, before I continue, remember that food and nutrition is competency-based. It's a technical area. So we're not going to separate theory from practical. We need the theory to execute the practical. So because it's competency-based, it means that you need practice. So once you start from the bottom, you come all the way up to the top. You will get it. Now, another term or another technique that is used, we call the roll and fold. And this is where a laminated dough is made by rolling and folding butter or other fats into the dough to create hundreds of thin layers of flaky pastry. It's not only for flaky pastry, but I'm singling out flaky pastry here because I'm going to discuss this a little bit more in the lesson. Now, if you can see some pictures here, this is where we do the roll and fold. So based on the number of folds that you do with the dough, that will determine the number of layers and flakes that you'll have with your dough. Now, I mentioned up top, roll and fold is a laminated dough. What is a laminated dough? It don't mean that you're going to put plastic over it and laminate the dough. No, laminated dough means that there is just separation between the butter and the dough itself. So the butter is added in increments. You add it at different times during the rolling and folding process. And that way, this diagram here, I hope you can see some separation here with the fat and the dough itself. So that way now, that's when you're eating, if you know croissants, or if you know patties, that's where you get like these different layers and flakes in between, because that fat acts as a separation to make it rise nicely, puff, light, and flaky. All right. Bake blind. Baking blind don't mean you cover your eyes and bake. Baking blind means that you're just going to bake the pie shell without a filling. And oftentimes, bake blind is encouraged, especially if the filling doesn't need as long as a cooking time as the pie shell needs. So you kind of want to give it a little jump start. So with that, just I have it here. And there are things that you can put in the pie shell to ensure that it doesn't rise or puff, because once it puffs, then you may have to cut away some stuff, and that I'm talking about, which is the base of it. So persons will use weights, they will use dry peas and things like that to ensure that it remains flat and it have a very uniform appearance. Aerate. Aerate is just incorporating air into the product. How do you allow air to go in? There are different ways you can allow air to go in. You can sift your dry ingredients. You can use your fingers. When you're rubbing in the fat into the flour, you just raise it and just add air into it. Some persons actually add small amount of raising agent, but that's not for all of the pastry types. They may do that for short crust pastry. But all you need to do, aeration is just to create volume in your product. When you're doing pastry, volume, volume, volume. That is a key characteristic when you're making pastry, okay? All right. So now let's look at the types of pastry. We have short crust pastry, which is a very popular one. This one can be used for most baked products. We have our gizzardas, we have pies. Some people even use it for patties, even though it's not the preferred pastry type, but it's just because it's quite easy to make. It's less technical than the others, so they may just employ this method to make patties. We have the choux pastry. Now, this pastry is not a very popular pastry in the Caribbean. But if you go to some hotels and you may see some pastry items that look like swans, or they have something that we call eclairs. It may have one side dipped in chocolate. It's made by this method. But we're going to go further into this method. I'm going to just kind of dissect it a little bit more when we go further into the presentation. And then we have our flaky right here, which is what I was alluding to earlier with the patties. And we have a nice pastry item that we call turnovers. Some person make tarts, different things. And you notice that there's a puff, looks like a pocket. I think the US, I believe, have this. We have it here, we import it, hot pockets. I don't know how popular it is now today, but hot pockets was a thing. Grab and go eat it, just warm it and eat it. It is made by this pastry, flaky pastry. Puff pastry. Puff pastry is a very rich pastry. So it's the richest pastry of them all because of the proportion of fat to flour. And if you can see right here, you see all these layers. It's just puffed and nice. And then we have this sweet. Some persons would call it sweet. But when I was at school, I was taught sweet. I researched, I hear the pronunciations as sweet. Now, sweet is beef fat. Beef fat is what they use instead of margarine, butter, lard, or shortening. Now, beef fat, and this particular type of fat is normally used for savory pastry. They may use this type of fat to actually employ other pastry methods. So beef sweet can be used to make flaky pastry if you're making a savory product. So if you're going to be making, say, patties, you want that beef flavor right throughout the product. Then persons may use beef sweet. But I know this fat is used very, it's predominantly used in Europe, in England, when they make like kidney pies and liver pies. And all the time when I tell my students about this, lad, miss, I'm not eating it. Trust me, you'd be very surprised. You wouldn't even know that you're eating kidney pie or liver pie. And I'm saying that because I was there. And based on how they flavor it, it's very delicious. And you'll see that right here. It also will give that nice, flaky, light crispness to the pastry dough. And you'll see it right here on top. Let me go back to that for a little bit. And you notice that the filling here, so it's a meat filling. It's a savory filling. We don't use sweet for sweet pastries. We don't use it for a fruit filling, and we don't use it for any sweet filling at all. It is strictly savory. Hot water crust. Now, this one is not very popular at all. And this one also is quite European. And this one is very similar to the sweet in terms of what they may use it to incorporate. If you notice right here, it's a meat pie, but it's a very dense and heavy meat pie. And it's not cultural to us, but it is a part of your text and you need to learn it. Now, let's dive into short crust pastry. Now, short crust pastry is a type of pastry often used for the base of tart, quiche, or pie. And quiche is a savory dish. Oftentimes, quiche, we use kalaloo, we can use ackee, we can even use a meat filling, or we can pair it with a meat filling and a vegetable filling, but this is very savory. It doesn't puff up. It crumbles and it's short. If you want to think of short crust pastry, think of a cookie. Just like how a cookie crumbles, that's how short crust pastry would crumble. And right here we have some very cute little tarts that they will normally use when you're making short crust pastry. And remember I said earlier that some persons would use raisin agents in it. The raisin agent would be used in the self-raising flour. Now, the self-raising flour already has the raisin agent added to it. So you wouldn't need to add it again. If you don't have that and you're going to use a regular all-purpose flour or cake and pastry flour, that is when you would add some amount of raisin agent to it. All right. Let's look a little bit more at short crust pastry. So we're going to this one now, this is when I spoke about cutting the fat into the flour. And in cutting the fat into the flour, there are different ways that you can do it. Now we're going to look at the technique in making short crust pastry. Now there are different utensils you can implement to actually make short crust pastry. And one such instrument is a pastry blender. Now the pastry blender will have like about 4 grooves on it, and it's very thin. And that is used to ensure that you cut the fat evenly into the flour. You want the fat to be distributed as evenly as possible when you're doing pastry making. And that is one way, just to ensure that the flour grabs the fat so it has that separation, like I mentioned earlier, when it will create like the short crumb, or that easily crumbled when you are eating the product, or that flake. But flake is not for short crust pastry. We want like some nice crumbles. Some persons will use their fingertips. Now the fingertips, when you use your fingertips, you don't want to overwork the pastry. And remember, oh no, you wouldn't remember because I didn't mention it before. So you can use your fingertips, you can use 2 knives and cut the fat into the flour. More commonly now I'm seeing being used is complex technology. What's the name of that equipment again? It's not coming to me right now, but I'll remember shortly. A food processor. a food processor. A food processor would cut the time in half. The food processor would ensure that the ingredients remain the temperature in which you use that in the beginning. So I'm going to look at guidelines further down, but I'm going to mention it here, and then I'm going to repeat it or just reinforce it when that time comes. So there are certain conditions that you want your ingredients to be. All ingredients, when you're doing pastry making, they need to be cold. When it is cold, it allows for that nice aeration to happen. It allows for the nice rising to happen, and it allows for that fat to be distributed evenly. When it is melted, once the fat gets soft or it gets to room temperature, then you have blistering, which you don't want, or you have a clump, and you don't want that. You want separation. And what the separation does is that the fat would actually cut parts of the gluten. Now, what is gluten? Gluten is the protein that is present in the flour. Once water is added, gluten develops. And gluten gives that elasticity of the dough. But you don't want too much gluten being developed. Otherwise, if you have too much gluten being developed, you're going to be eating boiled dumpling. And nobody wants that texture when they're eating pastry. Pastry ought to be light. It ought to be airy. And it's just supposed to be crumble and melt in your mouth. Boiled dumpling don't do that. All right? So let's move on. Flaky pastry. Now, flaky pastry and rough puff pastry are quite similar. Some texts will use it interchangeably. Some may say that the rough puff is a little bit different based on how the fat is added, but you can be safe to say it's very similar. And it's okay if you put flaky and rough puff together. Now, this is an unleavened pastry. Unleavened means you do not add any raising agent because of the amount of fat that is present. And when you're going to bake it, that steam from the fat and the moisture that is added, which is the water, it will cause that raising itself. All right? Now, it is similar to puff pastry, but it is very different. There is one thing I should have mentioned for short crust pastry. The proportion of fat that you use for short crust pastry to flour. So I'm going to be giving you a ratio. You use half fat to 1 flour. So say, for example, you're going to be using 1 pound of flour. You're going to use ½ pound of fat. Half fat to 1 flour. So whatever the proportion is for flour that you're going to use, it is half of that for the fat. Now, the flaky pastry is not quite so. The proportion of fat to flour for flaky pastry is 1 flour to 3/4 fat. So you realize that we're going up now with the fat content. And that is why they're saying it's similar, but it's a little bit different. And it's how you actually incorporate the fat. So with flaky pastry, yes, you will incorporate the fat similar, just like when you started with the short crust. Let me take you back to that. Because you do want it to, so you want it to resemble breadcrumbs. You want it to have that breadcrumbs quality right here when you're cutting the fat into the flour. You will start off with that with some of the fat when you're doing flaky pastry. But when you're going when we're starting now the roll and fold in order to laminate the dough, then the remainder of the fat is added in portions and rolled and folded in to the flour, the dough, I should say rather. So here we go. This is the technique. So it will start off with cold fat with the flour. We cut it into the flour, just like we said. Then we add cold water. Remember I said that all our ingredients need to be cold. And it needs to be cold so that the pastry holds its texture, has its texture and holds its structure. Because of the fat content, remember that once heat touches fat, it's going to melt. It's going to melt. So if it is already soft, you're just going to have one mushy, soft, doughy pastry, and that is, you don't want that. So if you start off with it being cold and then it melts, it comes into this light, crisp, delicious product, which is what you're aiming for. Once you have it now as this dough, Once you cut the fat into the flour and you add enough water, you add water in increments. Please, this is very important. You add water in increments. Now, though this diagram has a measuring cup pouring in, you would add the water a tablespoon at a time. It is better to have less than more water. If you have too much water, that's it. You need to start over. If you have too little water, you can add more to it. Please always remember that. Once you have your dough now, let's move on. When you have your dough now, this is what I was talking about, how you'd add the fat. Some persons would add the fat as a sheet. And this is where some texts will show you that there is a difference between the rough puff and the flaky, based on how you add the fat. Now, the flaky, you can add the fat in dots. And that when you add the fat in dots or pieces like that, or cubes for if you wish, should really be cubes. And when you add the fat in cubes, when you roll that dough over now and you are rolling it, that is what is going to help to create those nice light flakes. You know, when you're eating patty and the patty break off and you just see a flake drop off, this is responsible for that. This is responsible for that. Now, when you add it in the sheet with the rough puff, you will get the flakes, but you get more of air, like a puffiness to the product. Now, choux pastry. Now, this is not a very popular one. This is not a very popular pastry technique. However, it is important for CSEC students that you know as much techniques as possible. Whether you are going to employ it or not, you need to know it for theory. Now, this one includes eggs, and that is an important ingredient. And because that egg now is what going to add, it adds nutritive value to the product, and it creates sheen when you're going to be making the product, which I'm going to show you some diagrams shortly. All right? So now this one now is a little bit different. Remember I said that the ingredients need to be cold. Now for choux pastry, because some heating element is used, now this one, the ingredients can be room temperature. And it's actually best if you have it at room temperature to prevent curdling when you're actually going to add the fat and the everything. I'm going to show you shortly. Now this is used for making like puffs, and this is light and airy. When you open this out, you're going to see like huge air pockets inside. Now, this type of pastry normally has a filling. It normally has a filling. That's why inside is so light and airy. And this, I'm going to go through the steps for choux. You start by heating milk and the fat. And when you heat the milk and the fat, you're not going to put it to boiling temperature. You just want the fat to melt, and you kind of have it at a simmer. Some short, small bubbles coming up. And then the second step, you add the flour. And you're going to incorporate the flour as evenly and as quickly as possible for you to get a nice smooth paste over there at number 3. Now, once the paste has been formed, you're going to cool the mixture slightly. Or you're going to cool it slightly because you don't want to scramble the egg. So you want to temper the egg, meaning that you want to bring the egg to the temperature of the mixture that you have there. And by doing that, you slightly cool it, you add the egg, and you beat it in as quickly as possible. And you add each egg one at a time. If you're going to put all the eggs in all at once, I promise you, it is going to flop. You're going to get scrambled egg, and the mixture is going to separate. You don't want that. Remember, it's all about technique, and it's all about execution and competency. Let's go now to number 5. Number 5 is when you start to incorporate the eggs one at a time. You should have a nice, smooth, glossy mixture or paste, for lack of a better word. Once you have that, some persons can spoon it and others may put it in a piping bag. And if you put it in the piping bag, you should have like shells like this. Some persons will dust it with icing sugar. Some persons may dust it with icing sugar just to kind of enhance the quality. And right here is your final product. You see, just puff and light. If you are to go into that product now, break open that product, it's going to be like clouds inside. and you just need to fill that cloud with some filling. And this tends to be very sweet. This is a sweet product. Now let's look at rough puff. Well, I spoke about rough puff earlier, so we're going to just kind of glance over that one. And puff pastry. Puff pastry, this is the richest type of all of the pastries. And it's the richest because it has the most fat. Now, equal portions of fat to flour is used. So if you use 1 pound flour, you're using 1 pound fat. Equal portions. This is the richest form, and that is the distinction between it and puff, rough puff or flaky. Remember I said that they were similar, but there are some differences between it. The differences is the amount of fat that is used. So you'd incorporate the fat just the same as you would with flaky or rough puff. It's just that the amount of fat that you would use. And then you'd laminate the dough. Now, there's one thing I also want to mention before. No, let me go on before I mention that. So let's look at the functions of the ingredients. Now, the water, remember I said that once water is added to the flour mixture, then the gluten develops. And you do need gluten because you need it as the structure of the pastry. That is what going to create the structure of the pastry. That is what is going to cause the starch to thicken. And the gelatinization, especially with choux pastry, the gelatinization is just the swelling of the starch granules. And when it bursts, it thickens and forms that nice paste, which is what you want. And it's also, I mentioned that before, and this is just a little chart just to remind you of the proportion of fat to flour that is used and the water. You realize that we have it in teaspoons and tablespoons, not in cups. Let's go on to flour now. The flour is the structure, and flour also adds nutritive value to the product. The flour is the structure, and it also adds nutritive value to the product because once the gluten is developed, that's protein. The fat, it shortens the gluten strands. So instead of having gluten strands long, you have a strand fat, a strand fat, a strand fat. And that is what is going to create the air pockets and make it light and fluffy and crumbly and flaky. That is what you want. All right? And it also improves the color. It gives it that nice golden brown color. It adds flavor depending on the type of fat that is used. Most persons prefer to add butter because, well, even though that's an expensive option, butter is the most flavorful fat out of all the options that you can use. And the options would include lard, shortening, pastry fat, margarine. So butter is the most flavorful one, and persons will tend to use butter, but then you know that you're going to spend a little bit more money if you're buying that product. Now let's look at the guidelines for making pastry. So while we just looked at the different pastry types, we looked at the ingredients, the functions of the ingredients. Now when you have all your ingredients before you, there are some guidelines that you need to follow in order to have a successful pastry dish. You need to ensure that your ingredients are cold. I mentioned that before. Now, not only are your ingredients to be cold, but your utensils are to be cold as well. And when your utensils are cold, it keeps the temperature of the fat. And the fat is really what you want to keep as solid for as long as possible. And it is encouraged that you weigh and measure all your ingredients before starting. So you see like the choux pastry and the flaky, all of these, you don't want it lying there at room temperature. Some persons' kitchens are hot. You don't want the fat to come to room temperature. You don't want any of the fat to be broken down before you sit down. Oh, let me weigh this. No, have everything ready. So you're just adding. It's nice and smooth and sequential. Cut the fat into small cubes for ease of distribution and to prevent overhandling. Your palms, they are warm. Once you're using your hands to aerate by lifting it up or cutting the fat into the flour, you are bringing down the temperature of the fat. So that's why it's encouraged to eat. That's why most persons would use a food processor. That is what is current now. They would use a food processor, less time, and it keeps that fat nice and solid and cold. But you can use your hands. You just wouldn't use it as much. You try to limit the number of times you would be needing to aerate that mixture. And that's why we encourage you to cut it into small cubes. That way you handle the dough less. And though number 4 may seem like a repetition, it's not really a repetition. Some persons with overhandling, this one is with cutting the fat now. This now, the fat has been incorporated and you have laminated your dough. You don't want to be rolling. No. You just need the fat to be incorporated into the dough. You laminate it, and at the end of the rolls and the folds, you should have a nice, perfect rectangle, and then you're going to rest it. Relax it. I'm going to skip this one for a little bit, but you're going to relax the dough. Relaxing the dough would encourage the gluten to just come down a little bit. So if the gluten if you overhandle the dough and you have a lot of formation of the gluten within the dough, relax in between rolls. When you relax in between rolls, you allow the gluten to just kind of chill. So you don't get that tough pastry, which is what you don't want. And in chilling in between, you also use that as a method to maintain the temperature of the fat. I hope you realize how many times I'm repeating the fat needs to be cold. When it is cold and solid, that is when you're almost guaranteed to have a really good product. You add enough liquid to form a dough. Do not add the liquid all at once. You add it in increments as is needed. Sometimes when you add liquid or the liquid that comes with the recipe, you may not even need to use all of it if you have reached the desired texture of the dough. So you add it in increments, a tablespoon or a teaspoon at a time. Now let's look at the characteristics that you want for a good pastry, because it don't make no sense you do pastry and it's not a good one. Your aim is to have a good pastry. So the pastry should be light and golden brown in color. And most times if you go, so patty, I'm not going to use patty because we add coloring to patty to get that golden brown color. So I'm not going to use patty, but I'm going to use things such as tarts, sometimes turnovers. It should be light and golden brown. Now, I know Jamaicans who don't like to see things white because we say, no, man, it don't cook long enough. Not for pastry. Please do not overcook it. Do not leave it in because make it catch some color. No, it's going to be burnt. Remember that pastry have a high fat content in it. So the longer you keep it in there, the butter may be burnt and the color may reach the desired color that you want, but the butter is sure to be burnt. So you want it to be light and crumbly or flaky in your mouth. It should not be heavy. You're not making boiled dumpling. It should not be doughy or soggy. If that happens, then that means that you have added way too much liquid and you have made the product dense, or the fat was room temperature and you overhandled and overworked the dough, which caused it to be heavy and dense. It should be flaky. You cannot make flaky pastry and have no flakes. That's not flaky pastry. All right? So your aim is for it to be flaky and light if that is a type of pastry that you're making. It should be tender. When you take up gizzarda, I know I don't want to put anybody on the spot, so forgive me if I put you on the spot. But I have had some gizzardas that I have to use a knife to cut it. That really ought not to be the case. Gizzarda, when you take it up, if you're using short crust pastry, which is preferred, it should just break easy. A nice snap, and it should crumble in your hand, which is the crust I'm talking about. All right, so it should be tender. Tender. Let me go back. Oops. Let me go back to my presentation. Sorry about that. All right, So it should also have acceptable flavor. If you are making gizzarda, it should have a nice coconut texture. Now, some persons actually would put some variations in their pastry. And that is one thing I love about baking and cooking. You can make it your own. You just have the foundation, you have the knowledge, but then you make it your own. All right? So the acceptable flavor, the pastry should not taste like, why does it taste like patty and you're eating gizzarda? So you need to be mindful of what it is you are making, and it should have that distinct acceptable flavor. And there's one more thing I want to mention. You need to ensure that the fat is of good quality. It is not stale. So if you, for any reason, think that the fat is stale, please don't use it. It is going to impact the quality of your product. All right, so let us review, let us recap to ensure that we cement everything that we have learned. So, the 6 guidelines to follow when making pastry making, that was one of the things I just spoke about. Ingredients should be cold. You don't even have to list 6, but I mentioned 6 before, so the ingredients should be cold. The ingredients should be cold. You should measure and weigh all your ingredients before starting. You cut the fat into the flour, or you cut into small cubes to limit overhandling. Do not overhandle or stretch your dough. You add enough liquid to form a dough, and you relax the dough in between rolls. Why should the pastry be chilled in the refrigerator before cooking? That is to maintain the structure. You want the fat to be as cold as possible before adding it to the oven for baking, before you get the final product. How can we introduce air into pastry? 3 simple ways we mentioned before. Remember I said you can aerate it by putting your fingers, but just using your fingers to cut the fat and lifting it up and down. You can do that. Or you can sift the flour, and some persons may add a little tip of raisin agent to the short crust. Now you're going to complete your KWL chart. Remember, you assess yourself at the end of every lesson. What have you learned?